Thank you for joining. My name is Cheyenne Chatterjee. I am a program manager with the Charles Koch Foundation. I want to welcome you all to the second event in our virtual series of conversations highlighting the role of entrepreneurs driving innovation in post-secondary education. Today's conversation is focused particularly on creating and scaling new pathways. We've got three leaders from various institutional models joining us that are going to share best practices and tools on how they've navigated challenges, the existing system, and design new solutions that better serve today's learners. So we'll start with a panel discussion before moving into our breakout rooms, where you can dive deeper with each individual speaker. Now, we've intentionally set this up as an interactive event. We really want to foster collaboration here, but we've had a lot more interest than anticipated. So we're really excited that you all have joined us today. Before we dive in, I just want to outline some tips and housekeeping to make it a productive conversation, even with a larger group. So we've been doing this for well over a year now in the virtual world. So I think you all know what this means and are familiar with Zoom, but we'll be spotlighting our speakers. If you are still seeing 100 little boxes here, you might just need to change your view. So up in the right-hand corner, you can change your view to speaker view. And then we're also going to rely on the chat function to help facilitate some of this conversation, asking that you direct all questions for the panelists for the Q&A at the end of the call or at the end of the meeting to our moderator, Ryan Stowers. You should see that option in the chat to message him directly. And then you can also message any questions about tech issues or any other miscellaneous questions to myself, that's Cheyenne Chatterjee. We ask, again, just that everyone engage respectfully throughout the event, and that means just keeping yourself on mute in this larger group. And then with that, I will turn it over to CKF's Executive Director, Ryan Stowers, to tell us a little bit more, to tell you a little bit more about us and the why behind this event before we jump into the panel. So thank you.
Thanks, Cheyenne. And thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. We're thrilled that you're here with us, and we're even more excited about the conversation that we're about to have. And as Cheyenne pointed out, today we're going to hear from three incredible innovators in post-secondary education, and I'll just read their names right now. Cheryl Hyman from Arizona State University, Sarah Saxton from Peloton U, and Steve Lee from the Skill Up Coalition are with us today. And we know there are many more of you out there. So again, this is an incredible group to get together. Let me share a little bit about who we are at the Charles Koch Foundation and what we do. We're a philanthropic organization that empowers social change entrepreneurs to break down the biggest barriers standing in the way of people reaching their potential. And we're working with many of you on breaking down these barriers in post-secondary ed. We've got a deep belief in people and finding solutions created by those who are closest to solving the problem. And like many of you, we believe that the role of education is to empower every learner to do three different things throughout their life. One is discover their aptitudes, learn who they are. Two, develop the knowledge and skills based on who they are in order to help them become successful. And then three, apply what they've learned to improve their life and the lives of others. And I'm guessing you've joined us today because you're an entrepreneur in this space. You're thinking and acting differently about the role of education. You feel the restless discontent out there. You perhaps see and feel the wasted human potential, all of the challenged lives, all of the people who are stuck in a place that doesn't match up with their potential. And maybe most importantly, you're doing something about it. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that. And the way we're coming at this, we're not talking about tweaking at the margins. We're not talking about making things a little bit better. We're talking about transformation. And that means that the dignity of the individual learner is what matters most. There's no such thing as the average student. Learner voice should drive redesign of educational opportunities not the needs of a top-down system or an institution. And it means a culture of innovation and openness to new ideas and all people. And as much as we're all doing, it's not enough. And that's why I feel like it's important that we're here. Now, we're about to hear from an incredible panel, learn how they do what they do. And then we're going to make sure that you can share your insights with each other. We think that collaboration and partnership, that's really how we can make a difference and help all learners realize their potential. And we also want to make sure it's clear that we don't have the answers, but we're betting that you and many others do. And that's why we're eager to support much more innovation in this space. So let's jump in and hear from our panel of innovators. I'll ask each of the entrepreneurs that we're talking to today to introduce themselves briefly as a part of their first response. So I'm gonna jump in and ask the first question. So in the registration of this event, we asked attendees to share the biggest barriers they've faced. I want to start by giving the panelists a chance to respond to some of those responses that we received. So which of these barriers resonates with you most? And are there barriers you've felt or are still feeling? And Sarah, I'm going to ask you to respond. And I think I can't see it, but I think they're throwing a slide up that will help us see what we're talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. And while that's popping up, I'll start chatting. Yeah, thanks so much, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be with y'all today. I am Sarah Saxton-Frump, co-founder and COO of Peloton U, which is a nonprofit organization based in Austin, Texas. We have no relation to the bike company. I swear we had the name first. Cooler than them. Maybe not in as good a shape, but we're awesome. My background is in K-12 education, which is how I got interested in some systems change work in post-secondary. So I was a high school teacher and principal for a long time. And though I got into post-secondary innovation work with a deep love for students exiting high school, that has expanded quite a bit over the last 10 years as I've come to understand that those 18-year-olds I cherish so much then grow up to become 28 and 38 and 48-year-olds whose lives make it even more difficult for them to access post-secondary education the more time goes by. And so for me to actually answer this question, one, I chuckled. I was like, I have to pick one that resonates. Like, these are all pains in the butt. But the one that resonated the most is navigating existing higher education culture. And there's a few reasons for that. I think one is, so Peloton U is a nonprofit that works with other universities. And we ask a lot of questions about what might be possible and how we might do things differently, and learning to know the difference between this is just the way we've always done it versus actual rules and regulations has been something that's taken a long time. And often it's not a rule and regulation. We're just trying to push and challenge folks to really turn a cruise ship in a slightly different direction. But beyond the sort of higher ed culture within the system, I think one of the things we face at Peloton a lot in conversations, both with prospective students and also with all kinds of other stakeholders, is the culture around higher education, like who it's for, what the experience is supposed to be like, what the purpose of it is. And there's just a lot of dualism and sort of either or thinking. And I in many conversations with innovators over the years, I think a lot of us are a lot more curious about the and trying to show the world as it could and should be. And so navigating that within the higher ed culture and the sort of zeitgeist around it, particularly in this moment, is just challenging, and some thoughts about articulating ROI as well, but I'll kick it back to you, Ryan.
No, that was awesome, Sarah. Thank you. Thanks for your perspective. Cheryl, Steve, do you want to talk about which of the barriers resonated with you the most? Give you a chance to jump in here.
Sure, sure. I'm sorry, did I jump in?
Yeah, go, Cheryl.
Cheryl. Please go, Cheryl.
Thank you, Steve. Ryan, first of all, thanks for the question. Thanks for allowing me to be on the panel with yourself and the very esteemed co-panelists here. I will formally introduce myself. As you said, I'm Cheryl Hyman. I'm Vice Provost for Academic Alliances at Arizona State University. And prior to that, I was the chancellor for one of the largest community college systems in our nation. So that's just a very short resume on me. But I think all of these, as Sarah pointed out, like it was hard for me to figure out which one would resonate with me the most. I think all of these are worthwhile starting points for thinking about barriers in higher education. But I also think they're at a very high level. For example, when we discussed the concept of culture in higher education, I would suggest that there are many cultures in higher education rather than just one. You have the obvious split between administrative personnel, staff, and faculty members, but you also have more hidden set of cultures. Registrars have their own professional association, academic advisors has an association in their group, and many others fall into different non-institutional affinity groups. This means that the navigation of culture very quickly turns into a management of the diversity of cultures and the identification of overlaps between those cultures. In addition, I think there's a piece that may be missing on the survey, which is around leadership, which I always highlight and talk about. Institutions will need to have the visionary and expansive leadership that is required for any transformation in any industry, whether it's higher ed or any other industry. As you know, Ryan has spent 14 years in the corporate sector before coming into higher ed. And so this is partly, I think, tied to career pathways within the industry of higher ed that prioritizes those that grew up within one of these cultures, but it is also connected to the insularity that keeps talent from other entries out by virtue of their credentials, I think. So I think this may be something that holds back the industry a bit. A few people like me come from business and pursue executive careers in higher ed, but I am a very unusual breed in this industry.
Yeah, I love that point about leadership, Cheryl. That's so critical, and you're right. It belongs on the list. I think it's also highlighting why it's so critical to get this group together, because we need leaders, and frankly, we've got a bunch of them on the call today, I think. And you're right. The leaders that need to drive the disruption aren't going to come. They're not going to come from the traditional sources like they have in the past. So I love that point. Steve, what are your thoughts? What resonated with you? And please do introduce yourself.
Great. First and foremost, it's a privilege to be among such an august group of panelists. So thank you, Cheryl and Sarah. And thank you, CKF team. So I'm Steve Lee. I'm the Executive Director of Skill Up Coalition. And I emphasize coalition because we very are much a coalition. Our mission is very, very simple. It's to help the millions of workers across America who are struggling and to place them in in-demand jobs, working with our coalition partners to do so. Very quickly, my background, before I joined Skill Up, I've been here for about 10 months. I was largely in philanthropy. I worked for a foundation here in New York City. And then before that, I was in strategy consulting and startup space. So a mixture of sort of private and sort of public sector. So to answer this question, I think it depends on who you are as an organization. For example, we are a B2C organization, right? So for us, this idea of like student learner and their perspective is really, really important. But if you're a B2B, right, this idea of systems are probably perhaps more important. So I'll say two things on this. From a B2C perspective, and I'm speaking from Skill Up, the biggest challenge that we have is helping workers doubt their own self-doubt, right? They're in a stage where they're ruminating, they're thinking, they're mulling, they're frustrated, right? And they have some doubts. They have doubts about what's going on in the current labor marketplace. They have doubts about their own family households, and they want someone to unstick those doubts. And that's really, really hard, right? And so part of our mission is to help folks doubt their own self-doubt, to unlock that doubt. The second thing I'll say is a friend of mine said a long time ago something what he called the Whiffer Principle, which is what's in it for me, right? And so it's very obvious. It's an incentive-based world we live in, right? And so I see it from like a systems perspective, like how do you create the right incentives for people to take action, right? I think that's actually really, really hard, particularly from big systems level. But obviously it has to get done, because if people don't have the incentive, right, to take action and to make change, and nothing will happen, and inertia will kick in. So I always resonate with like this Whiffer principle, like what's in it for me, because we got to incentivize people to take the right action. And that's sure what's where leadership comes in, right, to help incent that. So those are the two sort of overarching thoughts I have.
Powerful. Thanks, Steve. It's actually a great segue for this next question that we wanted to tee you up to answer first, but I know Sarah and Cheryl will have a perspective on this as well. But it's fair to say that in society, when we're trying to solve problems around higher ed or post-secondary ed, everyone's thinking about 18 to 22-year-olds.
Right.
And the truth is, and you know this better than anyone, but I know others do as well, the vast majority of the people we're talking about, or the people we're trying to help get into a better place, they're non-traditional students. So how is this a barrier, and how does breaking down this barrier change the scope of what we're talking about here? And I'd love to hear from all of you on this.
I guess I'll start, Ryan, because I think that question was initially posed to me. Really, really important question. When I was 18, like I both knew nothing about what I wanted to do in life, but was open to any experience in life, right, as an 18 to 20-year-old. What happens for typical non-traditional students is they're older, the texture of their lives are very different, right? They've gone through experiences in their lifetime where what matters to them is very different, right? Very different from a traditional student. And many systems don't understand those differences. So things around what happens around the households, right? Around children, things of that sort, like really, really matter primarily for non-traditional students. And I'm not sure systems have sort of caught up to that. So again, this idea of the texture of people's lives are different. And the thing that I'll say is it's much harder to get someone to say yes, because folks, as you become adults and you've gone through experiences, perhaps you've gone through some experiences which were not always positive, and the people are always like, wondering, like, is this really for me, right? And so be ready to hear no a lot as you work with non-traditional students, as opposed to 18-year-olds like, hey, I'll try anything in life, like I'm 18 years old, right? So I think this idea of sort of breaking through, right, some of that, the fabric of some doubt of adults, I think is actually really, really important. And the last thing I'll say is you have to adjust quickly on the fly to the realities of the situation, right? So when we speak to our worker learners, we hear a lot. Like we hear stuff like, I'm sitting on the sidelines, right, a little bit. What I really need and want, I want a good job. I also want job quality. Like I want benefits, right? I want upskilling opportunities, things of that sort. And so we at SkillUp have tried to adjust. So rather than just be a career navigator, we've actually created a platform where we connect workers directly to employers who have specific upskilling opportunities. And the employers will guarantee you, one, an interview and hopefully a job, but also the ability to upskill within the company. And we just correct consumer to the supply and demand side quickly. So we're trying to adjust to the real needs of the current labor marketplace, which is really interesting at this moment. So all I say, Ryan, summary for me is understand your client, right? Understand the current times and recognize the texture of the lives of non-traditional students is very different from the texture of the lives of an 18-year-old.
Thank you, Steve. Cheryl, Sarah, either one of you want to respond to that question? If not, we can move on, but jump in.
I've got notes, like I got a list of things I don't want to
I
share.
do too, but go ahead, Sarah. I'll go after you.
All right, well, you can be the caboose. So a few things. So, Peloton U's mission is intentionally to serve students. We call them post-traditional, right? So this is, just to put some numbers on it, this is 74% of college-going people today are considered post-traditional. That means that they are at least one of these. They are older than 24. They have waited a year or more to go to college or post-secondary after high school. They're working 30 plus hours a week. They're going to school part-time. They are parenting or caring for a dependent. And there is another one that I am missing that I will remember later and say inappropriately at the wrong time. But that is 75%, 3/4 of people who go to college are not who I was, right? They're not the 18-year-old going right out of college or right out of high school, living on campus, like reading Nietzsche on the quad between classes, rolling in real late in my sweatpants. That's not the college going experience anymore. And when you run the numbers for how many people that is, there's between 36 to 45 million Americans who are 25 and up who have some college and no degree, right? It's like that is a lot of human beings who are by taking classes at some point have said that they're interested, and through a lot of sort of poor system design and the complexities of being a human and just being alive, have not been able to persist and earn a certificate or credential. And that's just I think it's just a huge missed opportunity for us as like people who care about people and as a country. So I think a lot about that, like that, we're this nonprofit in Austin that's hasn't even served 1,000 people yet. And we're talking 36 million on the low end. There's just a lot of work to be done to develop the solutions that all of those learners want and need. So I think a lot about that. I also think that there's really just one of the reasons this frustrates me, and I try to talk about this as often as possible, is there's just a very disproportionate focus on that 18 to 22-year-old, both in terms of creative energy, policy, and also philanthropic dollars. Like most of the philanthropic dollars in post-secondary education go to 18 to 20-year-old college access and persistence work, which is important, right? We need both. To my point earlier about the and, like we should not ignore high quality options for 18-year-olds at the benefit of our post-traditional learners. But that, so we got to figure out the and in there. And the one last thing, so I'm gonna lovingly push Steve a little bit. Some 18-year-olds do know what they want, and some 45-year-olds are lost as all bejeebers. But that's the reason why we need these individualized pathways, right? Is that the 18-year-old who does know what she wants, and this is the girl who dyes my hair, who now has a full-time marketing job. But when I met her, she was like a colorist, and I'll see her on Sunday. Like she came in at 18, she was going to school full-time, training full-time, and working full-time. She knew exactly what she wanted. She was done with her bachelor's by the time she was 21. Right? Like that's not the norm, but she found a pathway that worked for her. And that's beautiful. Most 18-year-olds didn't. I didn't either, right? Like it's fine. But the 45-year-olds also need some help figuring out what we want too. And so that like, you got to build options for all the stages, all the pathways, but all the sort of personal dispositions as well. I'll stop ranting now.
No, that was awesome. That was awesome, Sarah. Cheryl.
Yes, so I'll just validate what both Steve and Sarah said. I think for me, this gets back to some of the conversation about culture. At ASU, our body of students as a whole certainly do not reflect this category of just 18 to 22 year olds. As we all know, there is a massive group, as Sarah pointed out, of students with some college learners with some college and no degree. At last count, I think it was around 36 million. I'm sure after the pandemic that has grown. They do not fit within this category. About 40% of the undergraduate enrollment in America is in community colleges, which also has a different demographic than this category. I think finally, as both Sarah and Steve pointed out, working adults who completed their higher education but are now looking to increase their skill levels to retain their employment or move up in their companies, they don't fit this category. So I think it will be to an institution's detriment if they don't recognize these patterns, and these patterns are only growing. If they don't recognize these patterns and serve the actual students that they have, rather than the students they imagine they have or once had.
Yeah, no, I think well said, Cheryl. I think for those of us who are working to drive change in this space, this point about scope is so critical, because you're right. I mean, the way we're estimating is that we're actually talking about 70 plus million potential learners that need a better option. They need a better landscape of options in this space, and they're not getting it. And so that's a very different value proposition than focusing on, 10 million or 5 million or whatever it may be. And so we've got to change the way we think and act about solving these problems. And I loved your examples and your perspectives on this. Let me jump to this next question. And Cheryl, I'm going to ask you to respond to this one. The foundation, we recently conducted a poll where 61% of individuals suggested that universities need to do a better job of changing to meet the needs of students, whereas 16% felt that students needed to do a better job of adjusting to the tried and tested model of a four-year college. So with that, broad agreement that, something's shifting here, with that broad agreement that universities need to do more to innovate, what's preventing us from driving that kind of innovation? And Cheryl, I know you could go forever on this. Give us the
4 hours. Before I answer this, I want to add a point to the last question, Ryan, because I think it's extremely important. Many people may or may not have heard of what's called a 2026 cliff. And that is what happened during the Great Recession, is that when the economy went down, so did the birth rate. Well, the economy came back, but the birth rate didn't. And it's estimated that in 2025, there will be a peak of the typical 18-year-olds who will be going off to college. So the things that Steve and Sarah and I talked about, and you pointed out in this in that last question, is so vitally important. And if we don't act now, it's going to have a tremendously bad impact on a large group of individuals that we need to be serving in the future. So I just want to make that point. As far as this question, you're right. I can go for a long time, but I won't, because I will be respectful to you and the other panelists here. But I think this answer to drives at culture. I know I may sound like a broken record at this point, but it is so true that culture will eat any strategy all day. And I cannot overly emphasize that. That means that recruiting and retaining leadership that is willing to drive such change, rather than aligning with the ways things have always been done, is so incredibly important. I had someone say to me the other day something that was very simple, but I think so powerful, and that is, there is no innovation in the status quo. Like, you can't innovate around the margins, and then you can't make changes around the margin and then call it innovation. That is still the status quo. So I also think it is about, driving cultural change within each group of university personnel. And as such, I think it is incumbent on the diversity of professional organizations to drive the required change within their respective ranks. We typically talk about institutions and what they can do, but what about the professional organizations that many of our professionals and administrators belong to? They too have the power to influence some of this. Additionally, though, I think we need outside pressures to change the ways of this industry. And here, I'm primarily talking about change that benefits students and reflects the diversity of the needs of those students. That will include increasing levels of competition in this industry, which is currently heavily segmented geographically by socioeconomic status, and even to a large extent by race in America. It's just that type of segmentation. I think we need to develop better structures for individuals to be served better, reinforcing what Sarah said. It is about individuals and individual needs. Now, having said all that, I do not believe that this is about creating a lot of different credentials. I've seen where, individuals think we're just going to create a lot of different credentials and somehow this solves the problem. The currency still has to be relevancy, and and acceptance in the marketplace, acceptance among institutions. So the college credit, I think, has value to individuals, to employers, to communities by virtue of its ubiquity. So instead, I think higher ed needs to find ways to provide innovative, flexible, frequent programs for individuals based on their needs of high quality and relevance to the labor market.
Awesome. Wonderful. Love it. Cheryl, I loved your point about the outside signals. I think the other one we neglect is the signal the employer sends as well. So I would add that to your list. I think we're missing an opportunity by not getting a mobilized coalition of employers that are willing to change their behavior and drive that kind of competition in the way that you just described. It's critical. I really appreciate your points there. For the sake of time, I'm going to ask the last question, and I want all three of the panelists to be able to respond to this, but I'm going to ask Sarah to respond first, and then we'll go to Cheryl and then Steve. Many of the programs that are out there claim to be learner-centric. But I read that 67% of Peloton U students have tried college before and found that it didn't fit their schedules. So something doesn't add up. Sarah, what are some of the false narratives around learner-driven design? And I know Steve and Cheryl will have ideas along these lines as well.
Yeah, Cheryl, if you could talk for hours about the last one, this is the one I can talk and do regularly talk for hours about, but I will also be respectful of everyone's time. I think there's a number here, and of ways I can answer this, and I'm going to actually drill in a little bit to some things about Peloton that I think might be helpful. So the way that we serve our students is we blend competency-based degree programs with our sort of wraparound support that has a very proactive, highly relational approach to coaching and secondary supports. There's lots of like behavioral science and neuroeconomics that gets into it. But those two pieces we landed on because our students helped us figure it out, right? Like the core model that we are now running, that we've helped thousands of students matriculate to across the country, came from a group of about 20 students who took a chance on us back in 2012, 13, 14, and helped us design that core set of interventions, right? They got the right ingredients in place. And then every single other thing that has been added since then, every coach we've ever hired, every study space we've picked, every hours extension we've done, like our students have been a part of all of that. And so I think, to the false narrative question, I think when we talk about learner-driven design, we are often talking about building a solution and getting some learner feedback, right? And it's typically around the LMS or the curriculum structure or the way things look or how they feel, or maybe a little bit about which pathways and options are available. But it often is focused on the means, right? It's sort of focused on the process by which a student is going to learn a thing that some other person decided for them, right? And so I think we can do a lot to help put more power in the hands of the learner to decide what that end is that honors student goals in the first place. And I think we can have a much more expansive view around how learners can be our co-designers as we are developing supports for them beyond just a curricular structure or a UX mobile design. Like there are so many other pieces. No one has been hired at Peloton without being interviewed by students, like not the development director, not the latest coach, like across the board. There are so many ways we can sort of expand power sharing and involve learners in the design of our solutions. So that's one big thing for me when I think about. The other big thing is I hear a lot when we talk about learner-driven or learner-centric design, it tends to be a one and done experience. Right? It's you do sort of an initial build for something and then like, well, it's learner centric, like we're done. But learners' needs evolve and change quite a bit. And I think most of us hopefully on here would argue that our first drafts are not usually our best work and that we are very smart people, but sometimes dumb at first. And so having systems in place where we get feedback loops from students regularly about how to improve programming, service delivery, coaching approach, the way we celebrate each other, Like all of those things need to also be baked into our solutions, in my opinion, to be fully learner centric beyond just that sort of initial phase. And I think the sort of underlying principle that I would hope people would hear is, again, when we use learner centric, a lot of times we are talking about some experts consulting some learners to sort of extract guidance and then go back to their, our secret labs and make the final product. But if we are designing for students, you have to be designing with them. There's a phrase in a lot of activist circles, it's nothing about us without us. And so when we're talking about our learners, because I am not currently in that role, it's, nothing, if we're designing for our students, we must be designing with them, and that they are the experts in their lives and we can trust them. And I think a lot of times we still, as people in positions of power and privilege, or from more highly educated backgrounds, or from certain racial or cultural backgrounds, can still feel like we know what's best, instead of truly believing the learner knows what he or she or they need and helping to design a solution for them. And like, yes, we all have blind spots. They're all things we don't know. And I'm not saying that they know everything in the world, but we can trust our learners when they tell us what they need and design with them. So those are the big things that I think go on when we talk about really being learner centric versus seeming that way.
Thank you, Sarah. That was powerful. Cheryl, Steve, any thoughts?
Joe, go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I'll just say really quickly, and this is just reinforces what Sarah said. I just think many institutions expect learners to adapt to them rather than adapting to what learners need, which is exactly what Sarah was pointing out. For example, many institutions start most of their programs twice a year, once in the fall, once in the spring. If you miss the admissions and enrollment cycle, you are likely not going to be able to enroll in the vast majority of that institution's courses. In addition, many institutions organize their schedules around individual preferences for what and when courses should be taught, rather than the relevance and the needs of the students. So these are just like small examples of that gets to Sarah's point, but these are things that we have to change.
I'll just add, Brian, I think the false narrative is that most programs are not learner-centric. Primarily in the way Sarah and Sean described, right? So let me give you my experience, both as a social entrepreneur now and as an entrepreneur in my past, which is at the outset, this is what entrepreneurs think about, right? Product market fit, right? All that kind of stuff, right? And yes, let's get product market fit, and they do it. But once they do it, they forget about product market fit, right? Because they have to gum up money, and they have to raise money, and they have to sell customers and sell CRO, all that kind of stuff, right? So they got to make money, and by making money, you forget about the work of the learner, and that happens with the vast majority of social entrepreneurs. They just lose out. And so, just for skills perspective, we have a worker advisory board, right, on Skill Up, and just like to Sarah's point, they are not shy about where we go wrong. Like they are really not shy about, and we do lots of things that are good and some things not good. They are not afraid to share both, right? When I used to work in philanthropy, we had something called DIG, which is called Design Insight Group, where we had basically a tech accelerator program where we onboarded and funded early stage tech startups in the nonprofit space. And the first thing we did was we paired the entrepreneurs with a sort of worker learner in this case to give them feedback. And they stuck with them for the entire 3 months of the starter program and even after they started, because you need to get the real feelings, right, of your customer, and you can't do it by just doing product market fit, which is what most entrepreneurs do. So this, to Sarah and both Cheryl, this ongoing, like real-time iterative stuff in the current labor marketplace, you got to do it. Otherwise, you're going to fall behind the scores of competition that are in the space. There are a lot of folks in this space trying to do the same thing. If you don't learn customer, you're going to lose out as an entrepreneur. So I'll stop there.
No, that was awesome. No, I think, you mentioned when you were in philanthropy, as a philanthropic group, we see this all the time, and it's fascinating. And I'll throw myself in this group. We almost have to get out of our own way, because it's so easy to assume that we can come up with the silver bullet. We can come up with the answers that will help the learners get to where they need to go. And we've got to flip that on its head. And it's not, I think it's important to think about the customer side and think about it in that way, but think about what that means. Think about the millions of unique customers in this, and what does it really mean to individualize the approach? It means understanding not what that demographic needs, it means understanding what that student, that individual learner needs. And that's what I love about all of your approaches and the work that you're doing. That's why it's so inspiring. So you've heard enough from me. You want to hear more from these wonderful panelists. We're going to transition to our breakouts and give you a chance to interact with them directly. So I'm going to turn the time back to Cheyenne to help us understand how we go into the breakouts.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan, and thanks again to our speakers. We will, just a note that we'll have plenty of time for the larger Q&A segment with all of our speakers, but first we do want to give you that chance to dive deeper. So now that we've talked about these barriers to innovation, you've heard a little bit about each of their experiences and perspectives. You know, how can we look forward towards a solution, and what does it look like to actually navigate these challenges successfully? So with a large group, it'll be a little more structured than a regular open mic session, but we do want these to be engaging and interactive. So you should see a prompt on your screen to choose your breakout session, just with each speaker's name here. You can choose which room you want to join. You're welcome to change rooms throughout if you want to get everybody's perspective. And then we will regroup around 3:05 for a final large Q&A with all of our speakers, where you can ask any lingering questions that are still around or anything that new that comes up through the breakouts. So go ahead and choose your breakout rooms. And if you can't see them for any reason, just stay on and hold tight. We'll assign you to one.
I think that means everyone's back. So I'll get started if I get the thumbs up from my team. I think we're good.
I was just complimenting Sarah that she managed to answer a pretty complicated question and with 60 seconds to go. So I've never seen that happen.
It will never happen again either. That was my one shining moment.
I think we need to acknowledge that we're asking a lot of our panelists, and we're not done. So we're gonna ask them to be in the hot seats for a few more minutes. And what we'd like to do now is continue the conversation. We had an incredible panel. Hopefully you found some meaning and purpose in the conversations in the breakout. Now we're going to open it up to some Q&A, and if you can send your messages to me directly, then I'll make sure that the questions get asked either to the right panelists that you want to hear from, or I'll throw it out to all of them, or I'll even choose depending on what I get in the message. But I've got the first question, and I think you'll actually all have something to say about this. So I'm going to open it up to all three of you. But how can entrepreneurs ensure that their work is rooted in student outcomes, things that actually matter, versus the external factors or other things that we tend to measure, like credit hours or bodies in seats? I almost said something other than bodies in seats. Help us understand how we can avoid that and focus on what matters the most. Who wants to go first?
I'd be happy to.
Yeah, go, Sarah. Great.
This was the ROI sort of thread I was going to pull earlier in the very, very first question. Again, not to beat a dead horse here, but I think there's an and. We do have to deal in the currency of the realm and be able to demonstrate success in the way that it is currently measured. And that means graduation rates and credit hours and numbers of butts and seats, bodies and seats, whatever. And I also really encourage all of us to determine ways to measure students' success for themselves and figure out how else you can sort of case make on behalf of the students' own goals for themselves, and sort of helping funders, stakeholders, external partners, whomever, know that there are ways to define success for students beyond the way that it is currently being defined. We did a lot of work on this last year. I've got a bunch of things typed up I can share if anybody wants them. But we've started measuring agency, and hope, basically, using a couple of tools that actually we ripped off from the CKF data team that I should give them more credit for. But it's a great question. I would love to hear from everybody else.
Cheryl, go for it. Unless it's
Yeah,
okay.
you could tell I'm thinking. So I think I think we need to break. I think this really is about student outcomes. Like, what is in the best interest of the students? I think Sarah is right. Like, this got to a point that I kind of made earlier about, like, we create new things trying to get around the old things, but it's the old things that carry the currency in this industry. And somehow you can't really get around those things. And even when you do, they may have some immediate value to learners, but not long-term value to learners, kind of like the credentials thing. So credit hour carries weight. So you can create something that doesn't have any credit value that, you know, they may be able to get a job today, but if they want to continue to build on that, they have to come back. And now that, you know, may not serve them with upward mobility. So I think strategies focused on student outcomes measurement, like, we have to have those things and know what's important to learners. You don't have to always be tied to the traditional things, or you may have to figure out a way to innovate within those traditional realms. We have at ASU, and someone asked a very similar question to this in our breakout session, but there are ways to innovate within the traditional structures that we exist in today. A lot of times they will be about the specific institution, as opposed to, you know, generalizing a whole student body that's in post-secondary education. I think student outcomes, like, we need to break it down a level. The student outcomes may be too high level, but I do think it's doable.
Yeah, and it fits so well with the individualized approach. I mean, this is, again, where we fall into the trap of making assumptions rather than really honing in on what matters the most to the individual student. So,
Right.
Steve, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't play in the higher education space, so Cheryl and Sarah certainly have much more knowledge than I do. But in the workforce space, there's a bit of an analog, which is, hey, people care about jobs. Like, did you get a job, right? But the reality is that there are things that may happen before so, right, that might be really important. So the CKF team has been very, have voiced their opinion, maybe information is enough, right? Are there things that where you can change behavior by information? Can you change their grit and things of that sort? And we're trying to measure some of that stuff, right, through some of our qualitative stuff, to say maybe information may be enough to take you in the right direction, right, to get a job. And if we can do that, there's value add, irrespective of whether someone actually got a job, which is what everyone thinks about.
Yeah, I know, and that's a great point, Steve. It's fascinating how all this connects too. The data show that in the job setting, most people still care the most about purpose relative to that job, meaning, and those are tough things to measure, right? Those are tough outcomes to measure. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, though. And I think the closer we can get to measuring and understanding those things, I think the better we'll be. And I think it connects back to the vision we were talking about at the onset, this idea that we need to help learners go through a process to discover who they are as they develop that pathway. And a lot of times, if we can help them do that, the purpose figures out itself in some cases. So I think this is a really important point all of you had. So we've got some awesome questions coming in from the group. Here's the first one, and I'm gonna allow anyone to jump in on this one. Is visionary leadership on the rise in education? And what are the forces shaping your answer? So what are you seeing that's shaping your answer? This came from Adam Bragg.
Yeah, I'll say, I don't know how you quite determine is visionary. Adam, I don't really know how to determine that. Obviously, I have a bias because I think I work for one of the most visionary leaders. So I have a total bias. I'll admit that up front. I will say this. I do think that there are external pressures that are playing out right now that are forcing everyone to know they need to change and that we need to do something differently. I think there was already a need for that. But I think the pandemic, enrollments, more emphasis on completion, more emphasis on transfer and credit applicability and credit mobility. All those things now are putting more pressures on institutions to change. I think there's local pressures where you're finding more states who are investing less in education. So that will force you to be more resourceful with the resources that you have. So I think there is, I think there are a lot of innovative leaders in post-secondary education now. I really do. Not just the one I work for, but I work with leaders across many institutions, and I see innovation. I believe, actually, this may sound kind of cliche, but I believe innovation exists within everyone, whether we need more assistance with it, whether we need more resources, whether we need whatever it is. I do see that happening a lot more, but I do think institutions like ASU, foundations like the one we're working with now, we need to band together and help each other and not just say, hey, you go off and do these great things. I'm doing this over here. You do this over there. It's going to take all of us working together, because even we need partnerships. We need other voices. And so I would not say, I would just say that I do see a big shift. I think external pressures are forcing some change. I think more partnerships are starting to happen, more collaboration is starting to happen, but I think there are a lot of innovative leaders out there, to be honest.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Sarah. I'll follow you.
Oh, I was just trying to stop Ryan from moving on. You can go ahead, Steve.
I was going to say, I totally agree with Cheryl, but I'm also thinking from like an entrepreneur, the first thing you think about is like size of customer, right? So we mentioned earlier, right? Like there are 70 million stars across the country, things like that. So, those numbers are eye-popping. So if you're an entrepreneur, you're thinking, okay, there's a universe that I might be able to make money, right? If I'm honest, right? Have an impact, because the size of the customer base is relatively large, and therefore more people get drawn to the honey trap, right? Of trying to solve problems, and then things will be resolved in that. So I do think there's innovation going in the space. I think people are thinking there's a huge customer base that we can work off of, and things just build off each other. I've seen lots of stuff just in my 9 months here, in part because of that dynamic.
And I was going to chime in with, I don't know about visionary leadership either, but one thing that popped in my head while Cheryl was talking that I thought might be helpful is, just bear with me, I feel a lot less crazy than I did a decade ago, by which I mean, this was not a common conversation even a decade ago. People were not talking about the shift away from forcing people into the system and instead helping redesign systems to fit people, to serve people. And I think we are in sort of a groundswell moment where over the next, if I'm being optimistic, 20 to 30 years, that is going to become much more common. And I've already seen that in the last decade. There are a lot more people now talking about how it is not okay that the system does not serve as many people as it does not serve. And that means the system is broken and systems should actually serve the people that they should serve people. So that I think is a much more sort of micro view, but makes me much more optimistic than I usually am.
Yeah, I love that perspective. Those were great answers to Adam's question. Thank you. So next question. So this is from Terry Doucher, and if I mispronounce your last name, I apologize. My org is very focused on building learner agency and capacity to navigate current systems, not because we don't want systems to change, but because some learners don't have the luxury of waiting for systems to change. any well-scaled resources, portals, social media sites you command who are leading the way in learner agency capacity building at scale. I know about Gohar's guide on TikTok. Any other resources like that that our panelists could share? Thank you. So the question is about scaled resources or internet sites or social media sites that get the way, that are leading the way in learner agency capacity building.
Free, not free, age. I got options, but I'm trying to like triangulate a little bit.
Give them to us, Sarah. Give them to us. Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking You Aspire is a really fantastic like financial planning and FAFSA nonprofit out of the Bay Area that does a lot of capacity building for organizations, as well as direct free workshops for students that sort of can come with some one-on-one help as well. I got to run a couple other names down real quick. I was starting to Google. And then, oh goodness, I'm gonna have to go look up the other names. They all just ran out of my brain.
Yeah, that's okay. We can follow up.
Yeah. So, Ryan, as you know, this is something that is a big thing on my plate, like right now at ASU. So there's one thing I can talk about, but there's a few things that is not available right now, but you know that we're working on literally actively designing right now. So I just want to talk about it. When we talk about learner agency, we can define that a different way, like different way. I think of learner agency as giving them control, giving them information and allowing them to have control over making choices with that information or doing something with that information. So I'll just talk about one thing that's kind of related. We talk about this notion of pathways and individualized pathways and learners making choices. I think that's great. We have created, as you know, a technological tool that literally gives a learner an articulated pathway from any domestically accredited institution in the US to ASU. It literally gives them a prescribed, and that's because we have over a decade accumulated more than 1 million course equivalencies from institutions across the nation by partnering with them and other means. And so we've been able to build this powerful tool for learners to navigate themselves, understand what they need to do, and minimize their credit applicability, putting that power in their hands. And so, but we're also working on taking those equivalencies and building something we call a course triangulator that evaluates this huge database of courses evaluated across many institutions. And we're looking at putting a lot of this on our distributed ledger trusted learner network technology so that learners can have agency with their credentials and hopefully working with institutions to figure out how to give them more control over their credentials by way of these distributed ledgers, blockchain, and other things that we're working on. We're working on a credit maximizer, which will help those 36 million learners with some credit and no degree understand how to maximize their credits at any institution, not just ASU. And that's all possible because of this massive course equivalency database that we have. So we are too trying to figure out this learner agency and working on technologies as we speak for that very reason.
Great answer, Cheryl. That'll be so incredible. If we can, if you can accomplish that, it'll be amazing. And I believe you can. So final question, and I apologize. We've got so many questions, we won't be able to get to them all, but that's the kind of discussion you want to have. And that means that we'll follow up with additional opportunities to have these conversations. This question is from Baraconi, and he or she is fine with anyone responding to this. What are your thoughts on the emerging trend being labeled the Great Resignation, and what impact will it have on the personalized pathways that we're talking about? It's a tough one.
part of what I
Yes,
was going to say,
you-
right? I don't have. I actually have more of a question to the audience. Is I'm not sure who's resignating, right? So is it a skilled worker who's as opposed to the folks that we were talking about? I've never got a clear answer, so I've sort of like punted out a little bit because I don't really know whether it fits our population or whether it's sort of like a mom who lives in New York City. Like I don't know. Maybe we can get some insights, but I punted because I just don't know who the audience is. If I'm honest.
Yeah, I think the data, we don't have the data on this. So I think that
Right.
there is a lot of guesswork going on. Any speculation?
I think I was trying to just think about, as Steve said, like, what do I truly feel personally about this? I think people are resigning because in many cases, they may be pursuing new opportunities. I think they're looking for more inspiration, higher salaries, more purpose in their work. I'm not sure this is bad. This is all bad. We want people to pursue their full lives. Like, this is why I feel so strongly about rethinking and reframing this whole thing in higher ed called transfer. It's not about you simply walking across the street to another institution. It's about how do you apply every point of your life to something new in your life and build on it and make it more valuable or purposeful to you, whether it be personally or economically. And so I don't think necessarily, we should, or we allow everyone to pursue their hopes and dreams, not to fit into any one of anybody else's categories.
Yeah, I love that response, Cheryl. I think you nailed it. I think, we need to dissolve the barriers between work and learning. And I think what you're seeing is people voting with their feet, essentially. They want something more, they want something different. And again, I think that resonates with this audience, this group of us that care a lot about what these individuals want. We're trying to create better pathways and better opportunities for them. So that's the signal I take. And earlier on, we talked about the external signals that could be sent into the marketplace to drive competition. I think this is one of those. We're hearing from people that want something different, and we've got the opportunity to respond. So I'm so sorry we are out of time, but I can't thank you all enough for being with us this afternoon. Special thanks to Cheryl, Sarah, and Steve for their time. We're so inspired by you being here and the impact that you're having in empowering people to reach their potential. One story that comes to mind, just so we can end on something that's so inspiring that I was thinking of this morning. It's Brianna, a recipient of the Skill Up Together Fund. And Skill Up empowered her to identify her aptitudes, connected her to an upskilling program at Perschoolis, and then to an in-demand job. And so in a matter of months and during the pandemic, Brianna went from getting by as a custodian, working from 7 p.m. to 5 a.m., to flourishing as a technology support specialist. And she finished her program on a Monday and started her new career on a Tuesday. So it's stories like Brianna's about personal transformation that keep us all going. And they remind us of why we're pushing so hard for change. And in the spirit of keeping things going, please join us for the next event by registering today. We'll post the link here, and then share your contact information. And let's build this community of entrepreneurs that are engaged in trying to drive this kind of change. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.